To today's Connect webinar with Nutanix. Glad to see you guys are here. I did throw off that quick poll at the beginning to see where you all are working from. I'm clearly still at home in the room with all the toys. But it looks like about 80% of you are still at home also, and 14% were going back and forth, and just 5% of you are back at the office. And 0, can you see my 0, are in a hammock at the beach, which is like, oh, so sad. But wherever you are, we're really glad you're joining us today. So I'm going to jump right in. We are ready to get going. We're recording today's presentation, and you'll get a link to that. It's going to come from GoToWebinar, so be on the lookout for that. It should come to you tomorrow. Also, we'd like you to type in your questions at any time. We'll get to as many as we can today, so just type them in as you have them. And then finally, at the end, I'll have a short survey for you. It's anonymous and for CUGC use only, so please fill that out for us. All right, so I think you know who we have with us today, but just in case not, we have Jarian Gibson. He is the Staff Solutions Architect for Nutanix. He's also a CTP and a leader of the Kansas City CUGC group. And he'll be updating his profile picture. I say that, I think, every time. I think one day I'm just going to screenshot it, Jarian, and I'm just going to replace it. And we also have Ray Davis. He is going to be looking after the questions for us. He is a CTA and very involved with CUGC. He has a lot of blog posts out there. You should go check it out. I'll put a link in the chat in just a minute. So hi, Ray. Thanks for joining us. All right, well, that is my very quick introduction. I'm going to hand things over to you, Jarian, to get us going and tell everybody a little bit more about yourself. So here comes the screen. Okay.
All right, so today we are going to talk about Citrix on Nutanix Files. As you know, I'm Jarian Gibson, Staff Solutions Architect in EUC Engineering. Everything I focus on in Nutanix is Citrix on Nutanix. So happy to be here. And yes, I need a new headshot. I've kind of gotten let the hair grow since October and let the beard go. And so my last headshot here is from the last Synergy. So hopefully next Synergy we can meet again in person and get new headshots as well. So today, here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to do a Nutanix Files overview. We're going to talk about Nutanix File Analytics. A lot of the questions I get have been around profile solutions, specifically the ones built in from Citrix and Microsoft FS Logics. So we're going to talk a lot about profiles today on files, because that's a lot of questions that I get. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. We can always do other stuff if there's other questions around files in Citrix, but this is what today we're going to talk about. So as far as a files overview, so what is Nutanix Files? Nutanix Files is basically a file, a file system. It's a clustered file system. So we have basically, when you deploy files, you have 3 nodes you deploy for high availability. And with distributed shares that I'll talk about, we load balance user connections across those 3 file server VMs. They're in the same pane of glass as Prism. So on Nutanix, we have our HTML5 management console called Prism. Everything you do for files is managed in Prism, the same place as you manage your VMs in Nutanix infrastructure. So you start off with 3 different file server VMs, and then you can scale up or scale out those file server VMs based on the size of your environment and your requirements. And I'll talk about some of those decisions too. You can run files on the same cluster as your workloads, so the same cluster as your Citrix VDAs, to keep that file storage close to your VDAs. Or in some cases where we have very large deployments, you can run a dedicated files cluster as well. Again, whether it's a mixed deployment or a dedicated deployment of files, you run them, you manage them both using our same Prism interface. So no extra storage, no external NAS appliances. Don't have to deploy Windows file server VMs for your storage. No need to do scale out file server or clustered file server VMs for your user data. And then again, if you have extra compute and extra space on your cluster, you can use those utilization of those resources. With customers, like I said, we have mixed deployments. Some are in the same cluster and some are on a dedicated files cluster, just depending on the size and the requirements. As far as use cases, NAS storage, home shares, your user personas, think about redirected folders, profiles like profile management, containers like FS logics and user layers, and then use it for things like app layering, your profile management, provisioning services, Vita store, and share file as well. The nice thing is that you get 1 terabyte free per cluster of files included with your Nutanix licensing, and then you can add more licenses on for more capacity from there. So try it out with that free terabytes and then expand based on your needs. Now, I mentioned that we have different types of shares. So in Nutanix, on files, there are 2 types of shares. We have standard shares and distributed shares. So I mentioned before that when you first start off with files, it's a minimum of 3 file server VMs for high availability and load balancing. When you use a standard share, though, all the users, all the connections will go through one FSVM in a deployment. If that FSVM goes down, they'll fail over to another one in the deployment. But all user connections are going through a single FSVM. What we have, another thing is called distributed shares. What distributed shares does is we have top level directories. So think about a user directory. So server name, share name, and then the actual username directory. That's going to be their top level directory. With distributed shares, what we do is we load balance and distribute users across top level directories. So for example, if I have 30 users and I have a minimum of 3 file server VMs, I should have 10 users per file server VM. Of course, as you scale out and scale up, those connections will vary, but the main thing there is that we load balance and spread those users across the file server VMs in the deployment, so there's not a single choke point or a single point where all the users are going through. And depending on how many file server VMs you have, the more user spread and so forth. If one goes down, just like in standard shares, the users get redirected over to another file server VM to have their connections and access their data. Typically, with anything profile related, we are going to use distributed shares, and I'll talk about the different solutions and how they integrate with distributed shares as I get to the solution specific portion of this. So when you're deploying files, we talked about standard versus distributed shares. Always for profile stuff where you can use distributed shares. There are some solutions where there's some workarounds because things like the app layering appliance and even the way that user layers and user personalization layers do their folder structure, we have to look at some functionality that we have to help make those distributed. Local cluster versus remote cluster. So we have customers that do both. When they first deploy or first look at deploying Nutanix, we look at sizing to see if they want to deploy in the same cluster as their VDAs or if they want to do a remote cluster for a large amount of users and data. So we have customers that do both, but the main thing with local is that you can utilize your extra capacity, any extra utilization, and if you're sized for it from the beginning, you're very efficient of your resources when looking at local versus remote cluster. And then as far as scale up versus scale out, so again, we start with the minimum of 3 file server VMs in a files deployment, and then based on the number of user connections and so forth, you can scale those up by basically adding more resources, more compute, being vCPU and RAM, or you can scale them out and spread those out across your cluster, all the nodes in your cluster as well. So, there's both options to do that. A good thing is look at kind of finding a balance in the middle of scale up and scale out, but I'll talk about sizing FSVMs for user connections and so forth as well. So those are some of the considerations when you're deploying files. But for the most part, distributed shares are your friend. Local versus remote cluster, that's going to depend on your requirements. And then the same thing with scale up versus scale out. What about clusters? So in the past, I did a session on Nutanix clusters, and Nutanix clusters is basically extending Nutanix into the public cloud by running AHV on bare metal nodes. Today in AWS and with Azure coming as announced, so you can run files on-prem and in bare metal nodes in the cloud with AHV, and use some of our built-in protection capabilities to replicate the files between them, or use things like Cloud Cache and FSLogix, or other solutions I'll talk about later for high availability and replicating and so forth, the data for that. So you can deploy files on-prem in your data center and also deploy files in clusters on bare metal nodes on cloud providers. So what's new in files 3.7 to 3.8? So 3.7 with files, we've had files before in lower versions and for a while, but when it comes to EUC and Citrix and profiles, 3.7 was kind of a big release, and we've added some more stuff in there with 3.8. So one thing that we added in 3.7 was a functionality called connected shares. I'll go into that, but what connected shares are is basically allowing you to distribute a share at any level in the folder structure. So I talked about previously having distributed shares and top-level directories. Connected shares allow us to distribute below a top-level directory. Then we have continuously available shares, or CA shares. So when you have distributed shares and you're using things like any kind of VHD or VHDX container, making sure that if FSVM goes down and those users get redirected to another FSVM in the deployment, that they don't lose connectivity, they don't have any kind of user experience issue. So now we do have CA shares. It was in tech preview in 3.7, and it was in GA at 3.7.1. So now you have not only redundancy, but high availability of those containers too as well, since those are always connected to the file share. And then easier configuration. So in 3.6 and below, there are some extra steps for FSLogix. Those are default settings now in 3.7. And then in later 3.7 and 3.8, we brought in a solution called Smart DR. So traditionally with files, you had to protect the whole files instance via protection domains. What we introduced with Smart DR I'll talk about is to replicate data at the file share level. So you can pick a file share within the files deployment to replicate the data and not to protect the entire files deployment. And then SMB3 direct releasing, more of caching, in performance improvement inside of files as well. There's other features we've done, but these are kind of the big ones for EUC related features, and I'll start going more into these features. Any questions so far, Ray?
Not that I see.
Okay. So I mentioned connecting shares. So you can mount shares as a subfolder at any level in the directory tree. So think about things like user layers and user personalization layers, where they have that extra users folder. So usually it's server name, share name, users folder, and then the actual users folder. So the users folder in that instance becomes the top level directory. Well, since we can, by default with distributed shares, we can only distribute at the top level directory, we introduced a functionality called connected shares. So what connected shares does is allows us to distribute that extra folder in the path and be able to distribute those user connections across the FSVMs. This is not in the UI, so you have to go into AFS commands on an FSVM and just edit the share, and then pick your submount path for it. So basically, you'll have a distributed share and the standard share, or the folder inside of that path that points to a distributed share and makes that a top-level directory for distribution. So that's a nice feature, and it's very handy for things like user personalization layers and user layers as well. The next one I talked about was continuously available shares. So again, this is going to be able to, if an FSVM goes down that has users on it mounted with their VHDX container, it's going to seamlessly fail them over to another FSVM in the deployments without any user disruption. This is also in the CLI as well. So the commands here at the bottom. The one caveat though is there is a disruption when you're doing files upgrades. So if you're upgrading files between a minor version like a 3.8.x release or to a major version from 3.8 or from 3x to 4x and beyond, you will see a disruption with CA during file server upgrades. Now, if an FSVM goes down, gets rebooted, or crashes, or has other problems, all of our tests show that there's no issues there. Users seamlessly fail over to another FSVM deployment. But so far, the only issue that we've seen is during upgrades. So when you're upgrading files, make sure to do that during a maintenance window or a very low use window because there'll be a mild disruption even with CA enabled for files upgrades. Easier configuration. So this one was with 3.6 and below. We had some extra security on top of the regular user security that you couldn't delete top level directories. What FSLogix does when you use the VHD locations functionality is it creates a test folder. And so that was having a problem in bailing out in 3.6 and below without having to run some extra command line. By default in 3.7 and higher, this change was introduced to not have the extra security and to fully follow the user permissions. So that's not an issue anymore in 3.7 or higher. So Smart DR. So this is a big one in 3.8. So traditionally with files, all of the management is inside of Prism element, the per cluster management. With Smart DR, this is going to be in Prism Central. So Prism Central is our multi-cluster management. From a Citrix standpoint, all of our integrations are done at Prism element level, but this piece for Prism Central is for Smart DR for files. So what it does is it allows you to replicate the data. So think about your profile data, your containers or your profile stores, being able to replicate those to another cluster at the share level. So again, traditionally with files protection, it's basically the whole file server deployment using protection domains. But with Smart DR, you can have basically an active, hot, passive with Smart DR. So what it does is on one side it's read write. So the primary side it's going to be read write. So all these usually get pointed there. You have another file server instance on the other side, and that's going to be read only. So you can see the data, you can check the data and so forth. It's kind of a hot standby. And then when that file server instance goes down, users automatically get redirected over to the other side, and the other side becomes read write. So again, this is at the share level. This is very granular than the files deployment protection. And this does require Prism Central. Now, if Prism Central is unavailable, you can trigger the failover via command line. And also to make sure here that it will update DNS. It'll go through, works on Microsoft DNS, it'll update it and redirect the users. Also too here, there are some limitations, like you can only have 5 standard shares right now. Both clusters have to be the same Prism Central. So they have to be managed by the same Prism Central instance. But this is our first step into this area, and look forward to some more things to come, because this is just a start. So I'm actually happy to see this feature. But if you're doing like an active passive deployment or a hot passive deployment, you can use Smart DR to do this at a per share level and not have to protect the entire file server instance. Now, as far as deploying file server and shares, again, it's all done from Prism. So what you do is you go to file server dropdown in Prism, you do add file server and go through the wizard. And so when I talked about file server capacity, you can do recommendations based on your sizing, your connections, your throughput, but you can also start lower too as well. So depending on how many users, how many connections, what your expected throughput is, it will make recommendations in Prism for the size of your file server, and then go up from there. Once you have the file server deployed, you create your share, and the main thing when creating your share is basically using distributed shares. Like I said, there is a workaround I'll talk about for the user profiles, user layers and user profile layer solutions, but things like FSLogix or profile management or any other profile solution, you're going to use distributed shares for that share type going forward. This can't be changed after the fact, so make sure you check this box. Otherwise, you have to migrate your share if you don't. So that's all during your configuration of your shares. It's a nice little wizard to step through. It's pretty straightforward, and you can have a file server up and running in a very quick amount of time. Now, once your file server is up and running, managing file shares, so NTFS permissions you can do through just Explorer. So follow the recommended NTFS permissions by the solutions like FSLogix or Profile Management or Microsoft's profile security recommendations. But then for the share, everything is done through the shares MMC snap-in. So by default, it's everyone. But if you want to get more granular and lock that down, you just basically point the shares folders MMC snap-in to your file server deployment, and you can modify the share permissions from there. We also have a MMC snap-in for namespace and TLD management that you can download as well. That's also an MMC snap-in. Before I move on to file analytics, any questions, Ray?
Yeah, one of them you answered, and then actually all of them you answered as far as the NTFS, how you do the NTFS for permissions, and
Okay.
And I'm answering that right now.
Okay. So the next thing we'll talk about file analytics. What file analytics is, it's an add-on to files. When you have files, you have file analytics. What it is basically, it's kind of like your mission control for files, right? So it's going to provide data, statistics, but some of the nice features in here are things like anomalies and ransomware protection, audit trails, and reports. You can have up to 1 year of data in file analytics. And as far as detecting anomalies, monitor operations. So think about, different creation, deletion, permission changes, denials, renaming, reading. Think about any kind of different patterns that are out of the box for user usage patterns. Then, look at conditions if they exceed a certain amount of conditions, like operation count or percentage. And then ransomware protection. So think about, detect, protect, and notify if there's any kind of ransomware action. Audit trails, so have full auditing of operations done on the file server. So for your data, for your files and folders, think about looking at what the user has done, what the client IP is, having all that information to see what kind of data usage pattern they're using, and then have reports, so customizable customizable reports for files usage as well. The big thing I'll talk about is ransomware protection, because that's newer. And so with ransomware protection, you're still going to want to have, other things for ransomware protection, but Nutanix File Analytics can help you in your ransomware protection strategy. So what it does, it's going to scan for files in real time for ransomware. It will notify you about a ransomware attack, so you can set up emails and you have email recipients for those. This will work in conjunction with Nutanix Files blocking mechanism, so you can block file extension files and so forth. There are signatures for this for potential ransomware. You can modify, add things as well. But then think about, automatic protection scans based on the a list of signatures. You can add more extensions, more block files, and so forth. But it also monitors your shares for self-service restore policies as well, and identifies ones that aren't enabled. So again, it's going to help you with the ransomware protection strategy, but it should not be your only line of defense against ransomware. So a nice feature here to help you, because I know ransomware and security are big things lately, making sure there's no wiping of data or out of ordinary patterns in data usage. So file analytics can certainly help you in your ransomware protection strategy. Any questions on file analytics?
There is one question. Let me see. Do you have any way to tie this in with things like variants?
I'll have to double check it as far as integrations for that, so I'll have to do a follow-up on that one. I know with files we can do some things with via ICAP for antivirus, but I need to double check on file analytics to see if we can integrate with other solutions. So good question there. I'll have to do a follow-up on that one. Any other questions?
Yeah, another question. This files analytics work with FS Logics, and I said yes, but one thing I've noticed is that at times it doesn't get into the inside the VHD.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it'll show like an overall. It'll give you statistics and it's very helpful, but
Yep.
at times it doesn't show like, user click this file that's on the desktop, user click that, because it's looking at the container as a whole.
Yeah, but not inside the container though. So
correct. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some asks that I have from our files team to integrate. That's a good question, by the way, because we don't look inside the containers. So there's been some asks to our files team to see what we can do to have more visibility with files analytics to things like containers, FS logics, user layers, user personalization layers, containers and profile management, any kind of containerized solution, because right now it's kind of like a black box. We can see the size of it, we can see who accessed it, but we can't really see what's inside that container or make any kind of recommendations on optimizations or exclusions or that kind of stuff. So definitely one of the things I've asked for. So hopefully we'll see some deeper integration there in the future. So good question. Any other questions?
No, that's it.
Okay, so now I'm going to get into specific solutions. So the first one is going to be profile management. So again here, profile management, you're going to want to use a distributed share, and that's whether you're using the full file functionality, the mix of files and containers, or if you're going with the full profile container feature in later versions of profile management. There's no more file settings change for this. I'll talk about director profile reset. If you have like multi-site, multi-location, multi-cluster, of course you can manage these via policies where they point to use things like GPO, GPP registry, and WIM for that. Replication, since there's no built-in replication of profile management like FSLogix, you're looking at manual or scripted third-party software, or looking at SmartDR as well. If you want more of an active type functionality, that's where you're gonna probably look at a third-party software solution today. And that's going to be specifically if you're looking at the container functionality, because you can't replicate those without some kind of block level application type that can do that while it's in use. So profile management is pretty straightforward today. The only caveat with profile management is director profile reset. So with director profile reset, what it does is it renames, copies of data and so forth. Well, we don't allow renaming through that process of the top level user directory. So what you want to do with profile reset on files is put things inside of put the profile store inside of a folder in the TLD. So don't put the actual profile store itself at the root of the TLD. But what you want to do is use like those different wildcards for setting up profiles, like CTX OS name, CTX OS bitness, or like CTX OS name, CTX profile version. This is only if you want to use director profile reset. If you don't care, that's not a big deal. But if you want to use director profile reset, we have some customers that do, you want to make sure you put this inside of one of those folders like the screenshot shows inside of their top level directory for the user. If today you didn't do this and you want to migrate, you can actually use the migrate user store functionality of profile management. So in later versions, I think like 1912 or 1999 and higher, it can actually migrate between different folders. This not only helps if you put the profile store in that root folder, and you want to use director profile reset, but this migrate feature will also help you migrate from non-Nutanix files into Nutanix files as well. So basically you point the migrate path to the old path, you point the main path to the user store, to the new location, and when the user logs in and comes through, profile management will basically migrate that data for you. So we've tested this as a workaround with customers. It's actually a good migration story too to get onto files from other solutions as well. So that's profile management with files. Any questions there, Ray?
Yeah, I got a couple, and a couple people ask about the replication from site to site, and that SmartDR or protection domains. But then one good question that I'm not for sure about is with a new version, can you shrink the share? And I don't know if they're talking about like the compact script for a VHDX, or if they're talking about data deduplication at the share level.
So we have, yeah, so you can use, if you're using any kind of container solutions, FSLogix or user layers or user profile layers, or I'm sorry, user personalization layers or the profile container feature, you can do shrink operations, but usually that's an offline maintenance type of thing. As far as the share, we use compression on our shares. So you saw that checkbox about using compression, and we've seen customers get pretty good reduction ratios when using compression with files. You can set a hard limit on the share when deploying files as far as the size, or you can not set one when you're deploying files. So those questions, you can set quotas as well and that kind of stuff. As far as replication, I have a whole section on that, so I'll dive more on replication here shortly. Good questions, though. Keep them coming. So user layer. User layer is part of app layering. So it's everything is going into the container. So it's a VHD folder. You can use a distributed share, but because user layers puts that extra folder in the path, we have to do some workarounds, and that's where the connected shares functionality come in, or other ways you can do it. Location management, you can use GPO, GPP, registry, the policy engine from Citrix. Distribution, same as profile management, nothing different there. But because user layers are read-write containers, you have to have some kind of storage level replication, or you have to wait until the containers are not in use to replicate them if you don't have that. So that's something to think about when using user layers. As far as workarounds, we've had customers before we had connected shares. They did manual distribution. This is not as elegant, but this is an early workaround, which I don't recommend anymore. If you don't want to use connected shares, we've had customers use DFS leafs, and this is actually a good one if you don't want to use connected shares. So what you do is you set up a DFS namespace in that folder for users in that path. So your domain namespace layers users, that users folder points to a distributed share, and those VHD files for user layers then become TLDs by using this trick, because we're using DFS namespace to kind of trick it and have that users folder in the path. So we have customers that have been successful using this in the past, and some still use it today. But the other workaround, which basically is the same thing as DFS leaf, is connected shares. And so you can distribute at any level with connected shares. So you can use connected shares, or you can use the DFS leafs functionality. The main thing with user layer, though, is you have to be full into app layering. So if you're not using app layering and you want the same functionality as user layers, that's where you use user personalization layer. User personalization layer is the exact same functionality as user layers, but it's without the whole app layering infrastructure or process. So what I mean is, with user personalization layer, starting with 1912, it's part of the VDA installer as an option, and then everything else is controlled via the policy engine from Citrix. The only thing from there you need is a file share to point to where to store the UPLs. As far as everything I just said for user layers, it's the exact same thing. There's no difference. Again, the only difference here between user layer and user personalization layer is one requires app layering, one is built into the Citrix virtual apps and desktops infrastructure. Everything else is the exact same from there as far as the workarounds. So the same thing here with distribution for manual distribution, using DFS leafs and using using connected shares for that extra folder in the path, in the actual folder path of that user's folder. So I'm not going to spend too much time on user personalization layer because it's the exact same functionality as user layers, except without app layering. Any questions on user layer or user personalization layer, Ray?
Nah, nope.
Okay. So I'll move on to the big one, FS logics. So this is probably the most topic I talk about on a daily basis when it comes to files is FS logics. Because of the acquisition and because pretty much it's pretty easy to be entitled to it via the different options of Microsoft, everyone is looking at FS logics, whether either as an add-on solution to their existing profile solution or as a replacement of their existing profile solution. So when it comes to the share type, definitely want to use distributed shares. If you're on 3.6 or below, you have to have that settings change I talked about earlier. But if you're not on 3.7 or higher, you definitely should be. As far as location management, they have the policies, registry, GPO, GPP. High availability, we can use CA shares. Also, you can use CA shares for high availability with the other solutions as well. But distribution is going to be the same, except FS Logics adds one more option, and that's Cloud Cache. So, out of the solutions out there, they're like one of the only ones that have replication built in to be able to replicate up to 4 different SMB locations, which works very well with files. We tested it. The only issue I've seen with cloud, or the biggest issue I'm seeing with Cloud Cache, whether it's Nutanix Files or Microsoft Windows file servers, is that CA shares and Cloud Cache do not play well together. And what I mean is when you have CA shares enabled and you're using Cloud Cache and you do some kind of simulation of failure or the CA share goes down, or the deployment, like say deployment A has CA shares enabled, and you have Cloud Cache pointing to deployment A and deployment B. They both have CA shares, both using Cloud Cache. If A side goes down, Cloud Cache does not recognize that. All the SMB stack does on the actual client VM, but Cloud Cache basically locks and doesn't see the failure. So it's something that I've seen. Others in the community have tested as well after I reported it. The latest public preview has some fixes for this, but they still don't work. So if you're going to use FSLogix, use CA shares or Cloud Cache. Don't use them both. Cloud Cache without CA shares does provide some protection because of the way Cloud Cache works. But if you don't want to use Cloud Cache, I know some people still have a bad taste of Cloud Cache from earlier versions of it. It's come a long way since the fixes. But you can use CA share, and you can use other solutions like SmartDR or third-party software for replication and so forth that I'll talk about. Now, I've also had some questions about people that couldn't make it today that were sent over. So the first one was, are profile containers supported by Nutanix Files? Nutanix Files fully supports FSLogix, whether it's the profile containers, Office containers, or combination of them both. So we do fully support using FSLogix on files. Another question was, FSLogix recommends using REFS file system to store profile containers. How does Nutanix Files address this prerequisite? So yes, there's a recommendation to use REFS, but the main recommendation for REFS is to use it for a lot of operations of merging operations. So for example, in FSLogix, if you're using the RW containers to where it makes differencing disk off the main container, and then merges those back, if you're doing a lot of operations, that's where the REFS recommendation from Microsoft comes into play. I've also had others reported that the maintenance scripts for like compact and shrink those operations have been pretty fast with REFS as well. Now, when it comes to Nutanix Files, we have our own file system, NTFS permissions and so forth. So I need to do some testing to compare Files versus REFS, but I haven't seen any issues or problems with doing any of those operations on Files today. There hasn't been any kind of head-to-head testing, but that's something that we should probably do internally to see. But Nutanix Files does not support REFS because that's a Windows-only thing. So there's the answer to that one. And then another question says, we are currently using Microsoft DFS to store profile containers. However, Microsoft DFS is unable to replicate REFS file systems, and we're unable to add redundancy to profile containers. How does Nutanix Files address this? So again, Files, we don't support REFS, but Files deployments, we have high availability built into the architecture by deploying 3 FSVMs to start and scaling out or scaling up from there. So you have some kind of redundancy there. The other portion there is going to be CA enabled shares. So if a file server VM does go down, you will be redirected seamlessly to another file server VM in the deployment, and you won't have any kind of disruption of users in that case. Third, we have SmartDR to do the replication today in a read-write, read-only fashion. And fourth, you can also use DFS namespaces with Nutanix Files, but not DFS replication. So that answers that question as well. Think I missed anything there, Ray, or I think I covered that pretty well?
Yeah, you covered it well. Yeah.
Okay. So there's the answer to those questions. Again, we fully support Nutanix. We fully support profile containers and Office containers with Nutanix Files. We don't have REFS. We have our own stuff built in, and we have things that I mentioned to cover high availability, replication, and load balancing as well. So that's FSLogix. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was reading a blog earlier on that because I was looking at the question, and it was back in 2017, and a gentleman said that it's not needed because of the distributed storage fabric. Like you said, Nutanix's own, magic behind the storage.
Yep.
So that might help out as well.
Yep. But to fully set that to rest, you probably need to do some testing just to make sure.
Yeah.
Of those operations, but I don't think there's going to be any issues there. So I talked about if you're on 3.6 and below, there was an issue where we have an extra security where you had to disable a setting, especially when using VHD locations, because it creates a test folder when you first create the container, and it deletes it. And so with that extra security we had in our smb.conf, you had to disable that on 3.6 and below. If you're using Cloud Cache out of the box, you didn't see it. If you migrated existing containers over to files, you didn't see it. It was only for new user folder and container creation. But with 3.7 and higher, which everyone should be on, that's a default setting, and we fully follow the user security settings instead of the extra security on top. So there's your easy button for that one. Again, be on 3.7 and higher, specifically in the 3.8 releases, because there's all kinds of enhancements, fixes, and better performance as we upgrade files releases. Any questions on FSLogix before I get into any other considerations for files? Oh, I can't hear you, Ray. You're on mute.
Sorry.
You're right.
He said they're planning to use profile containers and office containers on the Nutanix file distributed shares. Did I understand correctly? We should not use DFS combination with DFS. So
you can use DFS namespace. You just can't use DFS replication. But you don't have to use DFS. You don't need to if you don't want to, but you can.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
No, he asked a second one, but I believe that we covered it on the first question.
Okay. So additional considerations. So with files in your cluster, so every time you deploy a node in a cluster with Nutanix, it has a CVM or controller VM. FSVM must be equal to or less than the number of CVMs. So if you have 16 nodes, you can't have more than 16 file server VMs in that cluster. You can have less, but you can't have more. Networking, just make sure that you understand the networking, that you're going to have your number of FSVMs plus one additional IP for storage on the cluster. Inside of ESX vSphere clusters, so we do support files on AHV and on vSphere/ESX. Make sure you have your data services IP set. When it comes to deploying files and maintaining files, make sure you have proper credentials so it can join the domain for AD. It can also do DNS updates as well. It will ask you during the deployment wizard to put in credentials. Make sure those credentials have the proper permissions to do that. Files, we do not support SMB1 at all. So anything that needs SMB1 is not supported on files. Anything newer should be using SMB2.x or 3.x anyways. So no SMB1. Another thing here is that distributed shares are your friend. If you start off with something else that's not distributed shares, then you're gonna have to migrate to, say for instance, you accidentally start with standard shares. Then later on, you're gonna have to migrate the data to a distributed share. So make sure from the start, look at using distributed shares. If you're using user layers or user personalization layers, think about using DFS leaves. Think about using connected shares to help you with that distribution of those containers. When it comes to sizing, so our smaller sizing for an FSVM is 4 virtual CPU and 12 gig of RAM. That can support 500 connections. That basically a recommendation is 500 connections per FSVM. Think about your connections per user. So when I have things like split containers in FSLogix, I have the office container and the profile container. If I put those in the same top level directory for the user, that's one connection. But if I split that out to different top level directories, different shares even, that's 2 connections per user. That comes into factor when you're sizing out your FSVMs for your deployment. And you can see here, based on your size and scale, you can scale those up based on your connections and based on your connections per user. So for example, you have 3 FSVMs you have to deploy by default. And if those are 4 vCPU, 12 gig of RAM, that's gonna be 1,500 connections across those 3 FSVMs. If you are putting TLDs, if you're putting both containers in the same TLD, that's 1,500 connections. If you're putting those those containers for Office and Profile in different TLDs or different shares, that's 3,000 connections because they double. So when you're sizing out your file server VMs, think about your connections there to make sure you have the proper resources on the FSVM. Think about containers too, because containers are very read-write heavy. FSLogix has been good to publish numbers It's like 50 IOPS per container per user on sign-in and 10 ops per container per user for steady state. They're very good about that, publishing that information. So make sure that you use, performance sensitive shares for containers. Think about your mixed workload versus dedicated files cluster. So again, mixed workload is on the same cluster as your VDAs. Dedicated files, they're separated from each other. We have customers doing both. Just make sure that when doing a mixed workload cluster, it's sized properly for the data, for the storage, and for the performance as well. We've had customers have the best success is when that's sized properly from the beginning, not adding FSLogix into, or I'm sorry, any kind of solution, especially FSLogix, into a mixed workload cluster after the fact. With Nutanix, we have hybrid nodes and we have all flash nodes. Hybrid nodes are a mix of spinning and SSD tier. When you're doing hybrid nodes, especially if you're not using cloud cache, so no cloud cache here, hybrid nodes work very well, especially with mixed workload. Just make sure that your SSD tiers are larger and sized properly, because you don't want that data spilling over to the spinning tier. And again, when customers are sized properly from the beginning, they have great success. We have customers doing hybrid nodes with mixed workload all day long. But there's a caveat here though. FSLogix Cloud Cache in our testing, and we're doing some more now, and we're going to be publishing a solutions guide for this. When you add Cloud Cache into the mix, that workload cluster, it does see a lot of heavy performance on it. So just be careful there with that. Typically with customers, we're seeing them with nodes with larger SSD tiers or more than 2 SSD disk in them, or looking at all flash, because of the overhead that we see with Cloud Cache, especially when doing Cloud Cache on a mixed workload cluster with the VDAs and files. Because when you have Cloud Cache on a mixed workload cluster with VDAs, with files, you're writing twice. You're writing on the VM itself, so the VDA, and the files deployment on that same cluster. So just be careful there with the FSLogix Cloud Cache impact. When looking at different shares, so you see here performance sensitive shares for application. A recommendation here, for FSLogix is going to be that one. Performance sensitive application shares, the random type there, because that's going to be very IOPS heavy, and so forth when it comes to that. Now, when it comes to high availability, disaster recovery, you have many options out there, and these are what I've tested and looking at. So file does have built-in, but file is more active passive. It's HA with files, because multiple files serve VMs. And also too, we have CA shares now as well, for high availability of those containers, no disruption of loss within the files deployment if a FSVM goes down. When it comes to replicating those for disaster recovery, you have Files DR, which again is the entire files deployment, or you have Smart DR, which is at a per share level. So there's you have with files, but today files is more active passive. With FSLogix, you have built-in Cloud Cache, which is going to be active, built-in replication up to 4. But when it comes to FSLogix, there's some say single container for everything, some say split them out. I'm more of the split out side, because the profile container is usually smaller, and that's where all the important user settings are, is in the profile container. So make sure you protect that, make sure you replicate that. But the Office container is generally cache, OST, OneDrive, Teams type stuff. It's mainly a cache that you can rebuild easily if that's not replicated, or if that gets lost or corrupted. So I'm of use separate containers, and most definitely protect the profile container, and then think about your options for the Office container, because that can be easily recreated by a cache in the cloud. Now, other solutions that I've tested is Peer. Peer will give you a multi-way replication, active type. It will do delta changes. It's going to be at the block level. It can go any to any, right? So you can go from Windows to files, files to Windows, any other file server solution. And depending on the solution, it may do API level integration. With Peer, if you're going to do differencing disk, so the read-write disk and then the merge back, for replication, exclude the differencing disk, only replicate the main containers in that scenario, because you don't want to replicate unnecessary data, because those differencing disks that FSLogix does, for example, those are temporary disk and they merge back into the main container. So you don't want to replicate temporary data. Backup 2, which is the popular one, which I like, is one of my favorites out there, and a lot of others in the community like it too as well. It's also very similar to peer, and it can do any-way replication. It can do any-to-any. So, Backup 2 runs on Windows, and you can point Backup 2 to basically directly to file shares. That works as well. We have customers doing Backup 2. I know those in the community like Backup 2 as well. Backup 2 is probably my favorite option. And so, for example, if you want to use CA with files, you can use Backup 2 to replicate your disk. And we actually have customers doing this as well. If you're using Cloud Cache, don't use CA. But if you want to use CA, use Backup 2 with that to replicate it if you want more of an active-active type scenario. If you're more active-passive, my recommendation is going to be use SmartDR for read-write, read-only, and then stay tuned for some more things that come with SmartDR. Any questions so far, Ray?
Yeah, there's one I'm just not for sure about. It says, what is the max connection per node? Is it an equivalent to the number of users? And I don't know if they mean like, what is the max connection for the actual 3-node Nutanix files, or if they're talking about per node for the hypervisor.
So I think it's probably files related, since this is more files focused.
Yeah.
So my way I'm gonna put this here is that we have recommendations based on sizing the FSVMs out, and so that's going to depend on how you size your file server VMs, and whether it's dedicated versus mixed workload as well. What we have is more recommendations. They're not hard limits, but they're more recommendations to scale up your FSVMs based on your connections.
And there's another one. It's talking about they're using user layers, and does it offer profile folder replication between 2 data centers in case of a failover if one?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we can replicate user layers as part of SmartDR. So you can do it at the share level, or you can use file DR as well. You can also use Backup 2 and peer. I've tested basically all 4 solutions on here. I've tested it with FSLogix, profile management, user layers, and user personalization layers. So everything on this slide here works in that scenario. So you have different options for that.
And that's it for now.
Okay. So next thing here, active passive or active pin. If you're doing multi-site, that's probably your consideration. Active is nice, and some do it. But for true active, you're going to need like something like Cloud Cache or like Backup 2. And depending on your connection between the sites and how you're replicating, there may be some delay of that data if you're doing a true active scenario. We talked about multiple replication methods. FSLogix is the only one really that has built in, but just be aware of the FSLogix, Cloud Cache, and CA thing. But like I said, people have bad taste in their mouth from Cloud Cache early on. It has gotten better in later releases. Just be aware of the performance overhead of Cloud Cache. And the main bug that I've run into is the CA Cloud Cache bug as well. Everything else with Cloud Cache in my testing has worked fairly well. Configuration, considerations, replicate user settings. That's the main thing. Any kind of cache that can be easily recreated, like Office stuff. Maybe you don't replicate that. And then, here's your options for Delta Sync for changes when you're doing kind of active and active pinned. Just remember that in true active, that's going to depend also on your bandwidth, your connection between sites, the rate of replication, and so forth, if you want a true active type scenario. As far as recommendations, if you're using files with user personalization layers or user layers, use connected shares or DFS leafs. Any kind of container-based solution like FSLogix, user layers, user personalization layers, the profile container feature functionality of profile management, enable CA shares. But if you're using Cloud Cache, do not enable CA shares. Use one or the other, not both together. We have our easier configuration. So I showed you for FSLogix. There's default settings now. SmartDR, you're seeing where things are going. I'll let your imagination go from there. But SmartDR built in for the per share level replication. And I'm looking forward to more coming from that. and then also to your performance for direct releasing for SMB3. Files 3.8.1.1 is the latest. Always deploy the latest and greatest files. With files, we're always adding new functionality, new features, better performance, and so forth, and always fixing things as well as we come across things with customer issues or internal testing. So if you can, always deploy the latest and greatest files. Let's make sure that when you're doing files upgrades and using CA, make sure to do it during a maintenance window, because there will be a small interruption there during files upgrades. With that, I think I have like 5 minutes here. I think I'm good on time. Any questions to follow up on?
One guy did ask about, can you say something about when the CA/Cloud Cache combo will get fixed?
That's on Microsoft. That's not on us, so I don't know.
Yeah.
It's been reported to Microsoft. The latest public preview of FSLogix, they mentioned there was some fixes in there, but I've tested that with both Windows and files, and I'm still seeing the bug. Also, I'd like to give a big shout out to Lee Jeffries, a fellow CTP, because when I report that in Slack, so we have a community World VUC Slack that we all talk in and throw ideas off each other. I posted that issue in that Slack. He tested it as well and saw the exact same thing. When someone posted that the new preview was out, that supposedly had a fix for it, I tested it again as well. So did he. We both saw the same results. So this looks like more on a Microsoft thing than on us. So I don't have any kind of timeline for that because this is a CA issue in general. It's not specific to files in any way. Any other questions?
That was the last one.
Okay.
So far. Oh, one just popped in. Nutanix Files licensing per user is possible. Nutanix Files licensing is per user? Question mark.
No, it's not. It's per. So you get 1 terabyte free per cluster, and then you can increase your amount of data usage from there. So it is licensed by the data. So how much storage you want to consume with it, basically.
Is it possible in the future to include Nutanix VDI Core?
Stay tuned with that one. So just to reiterate that, so we have when it comes to deploying EUC on Nutanix, we have 2 different types of licensing solutions you can do. Traditionally, we have our capacity-based licensing or CBL, but in the recent years, we've added a functionality called VDI Core, and what VDI Core is a per-user licensing. And so instead of license it by capacity like CBL, you license it by number of users. VDI Core also covers DR as well. So instead of having to license both clusters, you license it by the number of users and then allocate the licenses accordingly across multiple clusters, or for a DR situation, you reallocate the users to the DR cluster. VDI Core does not include files currently. So you'll still have to buy the add-on for files with VDI Core today. Also, too, just to mention, VDI Core licensing is only for a cluster running EUC workloads. So if you're running stuff outside of EUC, that's not EUC related, you have to do CBL. You can't do VDI Core. So VDI Core does basically dedicate that cluster to running like Citrix only on it. There is a small buffer for infrastructure for Citrix, but anything else outside of that, you have to use CBL or use a different cluster for stuff outside of Citrix, for example.
So I got another question. I've used one of the products, but the second product they're referencing I never used. The difference between Pure and Backup 2.
So Pure is more, so Backup 2 is technically a backup product, but it does replication well, and a lot of us have used it for things like containers. Pure is going to be more like a full functionality product. So if you're looking for more stuff, replication and collaboration wise, outside of replicating these containers and profiles, Pure has a full set of solution for you. So it's going to depend on your requirements and what you're doing. So again, if you're just doing profile containers replication, Backup 2 is a great solution. If you're looking for more than that, that's where Pure comes into play. So it all depends on what you want to use and what you want to use it for.
Yes, I know right now I'm using that Backup 2 to replicate from a test Windows server for FSLogix, and it works extremely well, but it's another interface you got to maintain and run it as a service. And I'd rather just do it from the smart DR aspect of it.
Yep. And hopefully we can make that happen in the future. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I'm sure they will.
That's just me talking. So any other questions? I think we're right on time.
Yeah.
Great webinar. That was really good information.
Well, I just want to say thank you for having me again.
Thank you. Thanks for coming back. I think it always seems like it's so much information. I feel like we should pop quiz everybody when we're done. Maybe that's how we should give away the prize.
There you go.
But thank you so much, Jarian. It's always great to have you on. And thank you, Ray, for moderating all the questions for us. It's really awesome.
My pleasure. I was trying to play catch up. I didn't realize the questions were in a different area. So I had a couple, so I was playing catch up, trying to get some of the answers. So I apologize, folks. I was delayed a little bit.
Well, in case any of you are wondering, I know some of you might have opted in for a chance to win the Bluetooth speaker, which if you were sitting in a beach hammock, watching this webinar, it would be awesome to have your portable speaker. I will pull the attendee report after the webinar is done and do a random drawing for the winner. So be on the lookout for an email from me to let you know that you won, or follow us on Twitter to find out who did win. And also, I did put in the chat a link to our survey, so we'd love to get your feedback. And I think that covers everything. Just make sure you check out mycugc.org. If you haven't joined your local group, you can find your city and be a part of your local group. There's always something going on. And I guess I'll return you all to your day. Thanks so much for being with us this afternoon, and hope you all stay happy and well. And we'll see you at another event soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.